Claire, good to see you. Thank
Yeah,
you for making a bit of time to come and have a chat. I know you've been super busy, so I appreciate you making some time to come and talk about what you're doing because it's pretty interesting too. I want to kick off with something that you said to me when we last spoke. You said to me, the health system is not designed for humans, which that really stuck in my mind. I mean, I think it's probably true. But what was behind that statement and why does it matter to you?
yeah. I think partly just my own personal experience, including some stuff that's been going on for me and my family personally. But um, when you look at the tradition of clinicians, right, and clinical specialties in particular, it feels very much like we're centered in kind of that world of dissection, right? Because that's where medicine began, right? By, dissecting human bodies into little bits and pieces
Yeah.
and then focusing on those pieces. Obviously, we know that all of our systems are connected. And so, you know, things like, I think there's more talk right now about things like how food quality, how the environment kind of impacts our physical and mental
Yeah.
well-being. But also when you think about, you know, we're in women's health, it's so fundamentally flawed because your hormonal makeup, your chemical kind of composition changes on a daily basis.
Mhm.
And so, we're a highly dynamic system. And so that means our brain works differently on different days. That means, the way we process food works differently based on how stressed we are. And, I think kind of everybody has that experience of, particularly if you're carrying a chronic health condition, right? Like how it feels sometimes like we don't really get at the core.
Mhm.
We're kind of playing this like game of whack-a-mole with kind of symptoms and complications that come up. But we don't really kind of think about the whole person and kind of try and get at, what are the things that are really driving ill health, right? Poor
Yeah.
health.
Your point about trying to get a more holistic approach. I mean, that's not new, is it? But it's easy to say. It's much more difficult to do. So, I mean, tell us what you're going to do about that.
Yeah, so we're tackling PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome. For those who aren't aware of it, it's actually one of the most common women's health conditions.
Mhm.
It affects almost 1 in 5 individuals assigned female at birth, so incredibly common. It's also kind of traditionally, one of the headlines is the leading cause of female infertility. But we know that it's actually much, much more than that. So one of the first things we're trying to do is actually raise awareness of the
Okay.
condition because
Yeah.
many people, even in the medtech industry, right, even investors I engage with, for example, haven't even heard of it, despite how common and profound it is. And so we're trying to shine a light on how it's actually a significant risk factor for almost all of the health-related killers of women. And so when you think about the kind of big picture topics in health right now, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular health, maternal health crisis, dementia, PCOS is like,
Factor
magnifies
in
your
all of them,
risk
presumably, is
across
it?
all of those, right?
Yeah. Okay.
But when you look at things like, I always find it fun to look at, preventative health programs for diabetes. Well, they often don't mention PCOS, even though half of people with the condition will develop type 2 diabetes before the age of 40. So, same for dementia. Cognitive decline starts in the mid 30s with PCOS often, right? And so, that's kind of for people themselves, right? People who might be struggling to know what their symptoms mean or, what the condition really entails as individuals, but also like we talk to doctors, right? Like, I presented at the diabetes technology meeting last year in front of like 300, 400 world experts on diabetes. I'm not a doctor, but I can kind of bang the drum and raise a bit of awareness. I think kind of the second thing we want to do, in the context of our solution and what we're working on, is change that dynamic between the individual and the health system. So, there's lots and lots of innovations out there. They're trying to help either the individual or the health system, but I think the real opportunity might be in terms of like enabling people to better access what care is there, because the system isn't going to evolve rapidly, right? Like there's lots of constraints, right? Lots of budgetary and other constraints in terms of accessing healthcare. And so we really want people to kind of be good consumers of healthcare. And that means if you have a chronic condition, you have to kind of become an expert yourself, right? Because if you're, you kind of have to be triaged, right? You have to pass through these barriers to access specialist care. And so part of that journey is perhaps, going equipped with more information so that you can kind of negotiate, I'll say, better. I had a personal experience a few months back, going to my doctor, not my regular doctor, but a different doctor at the same clinic. And I was like, well, I'm quite concerned because I'm bleeding heavily. Sorry, TMI. You work in women's health, you have to get used to TMI. And she said, how do you know? And I'm like, well, I've been menstruating for 40 years. Like, you can't just take my word for it. But I, because of my research for work, I knew the words to say. I knew the like specific triggers that she would be like ding, ding, ding from the textbook. That meant that I sat there and she prescribed the tests I needed to kind of get to understand what was going on. So, I'm obviously speaking, like I work in this space, I'm speaking for a place of immense privilege in terms of education level and everything else. And so we want to arm everybody with that. And so we're doing that in a number of different ways, right? So in our digital app, we provide like really high quality content based on the scientific literature. So you can rely on it. But we use the clinical terms and then we explain what they mean. And so, I think kind of shifting that power dynamic between the clinician and the person. And then when we track symptoms, we capture qualitative and quantitative data. That's using those clinically validated scales that then you can then print out, take with you to the appointment and feel more confident, and also show that to your doctor.
So just to get this right, so what you're saying is part of what you want to do is educate people about the condition. Part of it is to equip women with the right tools, if you like, to get the things that they need. And thirdly is to capture data so that you can further inform the way, the condition is managed or treated or whatever, because you've got better data on what has an impact. Is that a fair summary of the three things that you're trying to do?
Yeah, and I think really kind of it's funny because where we actually started, was from kind of a medical device lens, right? So we're developing a device which is actually going to alleviate the symptoms of this condition. But in the course of really understanding the problem, talking to individuals and what they were struggling with, we realized that a new treatment is super necessary, right? Like nothing has changed in, 60, 70 years, but it's not enough, right? Because, there's such huge gaps in information diagnosis and care. We really felt we needed to do more. Right?
And I can see that. I've got three sisters, so I totally get the importance of what you're saying. So let me ask you this: how are you defining success for this? I mean, where do you want to be, for example, in 5 years' time?
Yeah, I mean, it's success for us, right? Like on the startup journey, you have to be, both ambitious and realistic. So, every time I am given the opportunities to speak, right? Like, through this podcast, if one person feels perhaps for the first time seen and validated in terms of what they're going through living with this condition, that's success, right? And we know that'll happen, right, based on experience. So, day to day, it's like those incremental, like, somebody who's really struggling, if you can catch them and like they can know that somebody sees them and is working on something, that is like, the fuel, part of the fuel that drives us. But in 5 years' time, obviously I see the bigger picture around kind of neuromodulation devices, like really unlocking this form of therapy for both PCOS and other women's health conditions, and being part of that movement. So, to have a real form of treatment out there, to have captured sufficient data, high quality data, that we can start to inform, the broader standard of care, start to inform, like what's the lowest threshold information we need for diagnosis. That's where I hope we get to, and along the road, hopefully, like, it's one person at a time, right, that you kind of touch and can just trigger, like, one doctor who's like, oh my goodness, it makes sense to me now, who I see in my dementia clinic, right? Like, somebody kind of joining, other people joining the dots, I think is kind of that systemic change we're looking for, and then being part of both kind of the progression of health equity solutions, and also this kind of thrust to kind of use neuromodulation more actively for conditions that have been long overlooked.
I love a bit of ambition, and it seems to me you've bitten off a decent sized project there, because there are a lot of women on the planet, aren't there?
Yeah, and like I said, health equity, right? I think, particularly working in the PCOS space, it's effectively elevated androgens, male sex hormones, which we all have as female identifying people, in individuals assigned female at birth. And so, I think kind of health equity and women's health, right? Like it is part of it, but like, for example, we know that the metabolic dysfunction of this condition is also manifested in the male relatives of people. So the fact that it's been overlooked in terms of the broader health implications is also leaving opportunities in the dark around the male relatives of women with this condition. So, and I think that principle, right, like of, we've studied this fictional norm of a 70-kilogram white man in his 30s who's healthy, right? We've studied them and based our medicine on them for a very long time.
It's not necessarily the best model, is it?
Well, it's a simpler model, right? So it's a simpler model. And so our hope is, with advances in AI and other technology, and by joining the dots between self-reported data, at-home hormone testing results, all of those things, we can unlock things that don't just benefit
you mentioned
condition, but everybody, right?
Yeah, you just mentioned AI. Tell me about the data play here. How do you see that sort of contributing to the rollout or to the goals that you want to achieve? Because one of the things that is going to do is create a load of data that don't exist currently, isn't it?
Yeah, obviously, you're right. The data doesn't exist, and the system, like the traditional system of like clinical research, is a very incremental system. So when you apply for a grant, they want to know what like you're building on. And so where you're building on perhaps not very much, right, which is often the case in women's health, it then makes it harder. So we think about real world evidence as really being kind of this rich space where we can kind of leapfrog some of the constraints of that incremental system. And AI allows us to handle levels of complexity that we haven't been able to. So for example, and to be honest, you don't need that much to do new things, right? So for us, we looked at a publicly available data set, and it wasn't, like it was just kind of self-reported data. I think it was 160 women, but they reported on how severe some of their symptoms were to do with PCOS. We used that data, we did some AI clustering analysis, we interrogated it in multiple ways, and what we were able to do with just 160 data sets, and again, very subjective, like it was like rank your acne 1 to 5, like it wasn't using those clinically validated scales, but we were still able to clearly see phenotypes, like so different manifestations of the condition. And so what we did was then, okay, if we can see that from 160 data sets, we can validate that, there's a research paper that's done this scientifically, but our results look the same. So, obviously then that's the type of functionality we can immediately start building into our solution for women. I think one of the things I'm working on right now is, if you look at our user group, you look at kind of what they're doing and what they're using, right? They're often on some form of hormonal medication. They're often on metformin, insulin, or GLP-1, like a weight loss drug. Plus they're doing, they're taking supplements, they're, trying all sorts of diets, like everything from a lifestyle modification. Our hope is that we can we'll work to really understand like what works for different people. So, we all kind of try different things for our health, but you get exhausted, right? You try another diet, your friend says this works for me. I've lost 20 pounds, and you try it and you're like, I just gained 5, like what happened, right? Because it doesn't work for you. And so, our hope is we can find things like medication interactions, like we can find things like, for this particular subtype of people with the condition who have these really bad symptoms, like these are the interventions which are going to be more effective.
I mean, it's interesting you describe that, because what you're saying is it's not just about better data, it's about better interpretation of the data. And because when we get to a point where everyone's got all the data, the thing that will create a competitive edge is having a better interpretation. Being able to get more insights out of the data than other people, or different insights. So it's interesting you describe that. Let me come back to something you were talking about a second ago about, building a business is. Pretty much all the entrepreneurs I know will say it's a tough gig. It's got its good days and bad days. What is it about this particular business that you're working on that kind of gets you out of bed to ride that kind of roller coaster every day? I mean, what is it about this that motivates you particularly?
When we decided, like, we originally were focused in a different area for our business, and we decided to pivot, and we were looking at large unmet clinical needs that could be potentially addressed with non-invasive or minimally invasive neuromodulation. And so we were like, I had my consultant hat on. We had a very structured approach, but then we learned about PCOS, and we just got mad, right? Like, you don't have to be, I've never been diagnosed with PCOS, but I suspect I have it. But you don't have to be personally affected to go like, how can this stand? Like, how can this be a thing where, the best option we have today is go away medicine, right? Don't diagnose, give you the pill, come back when you want to get pregnant, right? Like, it's disgraceful, right? Like, for a chronic condition of this severity. And we're like, okay, so can we do anything about it? And then we found this work out of Sweden where, our advisor, who's this amazing researcher, who's kind of probably the most globally respected leader in this space, she'd done the research, right? She delivered stimulation to this population and shown, it's not a magic pill, right? It's not going to fix you, right? But tangible improvements in the metabolic side, the hormonal, the menstrual side of the condition. And so we had to, right? And then, of course, as I started diving in, it's like, well, we can't just do that, right? Like, if we really want to help fix this problem, we have to do more than just give somebody another, option, right? It's important to give them another option, but it doesn't end there. Like, I mean, as we go through life, we all develop kind of our system of how we take care of our physical and mental health, right? And it takes a system. It's not just one thing. So yeah, I just had to. I mean, it's it's I do find it fascinating. I think kind of, you're talking about kind of like AI and the competitive edge. I mean, for me, part of the competitive edge is the fact that I necessarily come to the topic with a beginner's mind. I'm not a clinician. I lasted, chemistry at the age of 18, right? Like it's been many years. And so, like I ask the questions and then I kind of
curiosity goes a long way, doesn't it?
Yeah, dig in, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes that means I find things that, others who are, way more qualified, than me, they've never asked the question.
Yeah. And how do you feel about being the CEO? I mean, that I always think that, well, we've talked about this in the past. I mean, I always think the CEO's job is a really interesting job because you've got to kind of piece together all the different bits to build the business, to make it happen, the things that, to achieve the goals that you want to achieve. I mean, how do you feel about being the CEO?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I mean, I'd say my superpower is joining the dots, right? So being able to digest, like it's a two-way thing, right? So being able to digest lots of different information and make sense of it. And on the flip side, kind of seeing kind of a strategic goal or where we want to go, and then knowing what all the steps and all the activities that are required. So that's kind of what I'm best at. Obviously, I could apply that in lots of different roles. I think, I am, I'm finding at this stage of my life that, I feel like my younger self, my much younger self, because I'm shedding some of the expectations of others and caring what others think. I think women often go through this process as they
So let
kind
me just get this right, because this
of
is
midlife and
important.
beyond.
What you're saying is that being a CEO makes you younger. That's a winner.
For me, right? Like you've got to be, if you're going to have any modicum of success, if you're going to stand up and represent your company, you are going to be hit by an onslaught of naysayers,
Yeah.
people who envy you, like, although it's a tough road, like there's still lots of kind of like negative things get thrown at you, and you hear no 1,000 times a week, right? You have to develop this level of, stubbornness, right? Like grit, whatever positive or negative thing you want to assign to it. And I think, I found through like a lot of my professional life, others who want to make themselves feel big by making you feel small. And I'd succumb to that. And like now at this stage of my life, I'm like I know I'm, throw a lot into what I'm doing. I know I'm talented, right? In lots of ways. I have a lot to bring. I know I'm dumb in lots of ways. I'm going to make mistakes, but, there's no reason why I shouldn't pick up the
No,
mantle.
absolutely not. No, that's right. That's right. I'll come back to the mistakes in a second, but I wanted to ask you, um, I mean, mistakes are a big issue for entrepreneurs, and I'll come back to that in a second. But as you've been building the company, have there been any particular surprises when you've been shocked at how things have turned out, or things have turned out in very different ways to what you were expecting?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of we started off in hardware, and we started off in invasive neurotech, literally putting things inside your brain. So when we shifted and we're like less invasive, and then with the switch, to include partly a digital solution, we're like, oh, this is going to be so much easier. And you hear a lot about, you can like you can sit in your bedroom and make an app, right, in a couple of hours, but that's not the kind of solution we want to build, right? We want to build something that's really informed and thoughtful, and so that process takes longer, right? We want to build something that has the right level of privacy controls to protect our users, right? That stuff takes longer. It's not something that you can make a demo, right, and do that very quickly, but actually building something that's robust and secure and thoughtfully structured, that takes a while. So like, but we're
But
not
presumably longer than you thought.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, every CEO I speak to is never happy with how quickly things are going. They always want it to go faster. But sometimes things just can't go faster, can they? I mean, it's a bit like having a baby. It takes 9 months. It's just the way it is. Let me come back to the mistakes piece. So what would you say are the big mistakes that you've made?
I don't know. We try and make as many mistakes as quickly as possible, to be honest, Paul.
But tell me more. So why do you do that? Tell me why.
I, I think from the beginning we've had kind of a mantra around, um, there's only one way to fail. Well, you can not try and then you fail. But if you screw up and you don't learn anything from it, that's real failure.
Yeah.
But inherent in the process is trying lots of things that don't work and learning from it. So it's better to make lots and lots of small errors, right, than catastrophic, like a small number of big catastrophic errors. Because it's those learning cycles, right, that really, I think, ultimately drive longer term success. Yeah. So, I think often mistakes that are hard to avoid are people mistakes. You know, I'm somebody who extends trust first. I'm a bit of an open book. I'm quite transparent. And I think kind of, the things I would linger on are just kind of people things, right? Where we wish that things had been dealt with sooner, or things had turned out differently in terms of interpersonal friction.
Yeah. Let me just pick up one of the points that you made. I mean, what you described was doing things and getting them wrong. I mean, that's one kind of mistake, isn't it? I mean, I call that a mistake of commission, an error of commission. You do something and you discover it wasn't the right thing. But there's also another set of mistakes, which are what you might call errors of omission, where you should have done something and you didn't. And my experience has been those are actually some of the worst. I mean, I've done plenty of stupid things, but I've also not done the right things on quite a few occasions. I mean, have you had any of those experiences when you look back and you think, oh God, I wish I'd done those things and I really, that was the thing to do and I didn't?
Yeah, I mean, it may sound kind of nitpicky, but I'm often conscious of, I don't always have the perfect language.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm happy to chat, right, and quite open. So, even when we talk about, this condition and who it affects, we operate in women's health, FemTech, right, health equity. Then I learned that maybe 80-90% of people who haven't gone through gender affirmation surgery or treatment, hormonal treatment, so treatment naive trans males, have this condition. So, I was like, how could, so I was like, oh, like some of the ways I've been talking about it and some of the ways I still do talk about it feel somewhat exclusionary.
Yeah. Yeah.
in similar ways, I kind of hit up against that where the constraints in the research. So, it's Black Maternal Health Month, right? So I would love to publish a bunch of synthesized research about the intersection between maternal health, being Black or African American, and PCOS. Mm. There's not enough, like, today I'm like scraping, right, to pull that together, right? Like there's not quite enough there, right? So I feel incomplete because, every time I hit up about, we can't do that research, right? Like that's beyond the scope of what we can do. But, I feel kind of incomplete about some of these things where
it sounds pretty frustrating.
Yeah. And then I don't feel like I necessarily am equipped with enough knowledge or information or the right language to talk about certain things.
Let me ask about the language thing, because that's interesting. And I know you've got big ambitions. I mean, working with women, let's say in Canada, it's going to be very different from working with groups of women in, let's say, India. I mean, have you got thoughts about how you manage those challenges? I mean, because that's partly about the kind of culture. I mean, the things that and people's expectations. I mean, the culture is obviously different in India, but people's expectations are different. I mean, individual expectations are different, which I guess is partly what forms the culture. But have you got thoughts on those issues? Because I mean, I guess if a lot of what you do is about communicating with people, which is what you were talking about at the beginning, the need to kind of inform and educate and I mean, how are you going to do that in some of those kind of cultural environments that are, unfamiliar, for want of a better way of describing it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, sadly, some of the issues in barriers, systemic challenges in women's health are everywhere. So I talk to people, particularly advocates around PCOS in, Kenya, the Philippines, China, France, right? Like I talk to people around the world, and some of the issues are exactly the same, right? So there's some overlapping need there, right? That obviously we're trying to fill. The resource levels, right, are different in different places. So just the amount of money that's available, either within the healthcare system or in people's pockets, right, to access different solutions. So, we think very hard about accessibility. So we try and kind of have a always free-ish, right, level. And then, kind of a think about pricing to make sure that it's actually, at least with the digital solution, something that can proliferate in lots of markets. And then things like the privacy challenge. Like the privacy challenge is very different if you're in the US right now than if you're in Western Europe, right? Like, so in terms of the gap between the risk that an individual takes and the systems to support and take care of you, right? Versus kind of take advantage of that. So like our general approach is to stay true to the science as much as possible, right? So the content is very much embedded. So we have a chatbot, but it's only trained on content that we've like synthesized, right? So it's only going to tell you things that are true, backed up by research. We think about in terms of how we kind of roll out our solution to different cultures and languages, doing that with partners.
I mean, and just to pick up that point, I mean, presumably that's also quite challenging because, I mean, different health systems are different. I mean, working with the NHS is going to be very different from working with hospitals in the US, for example, which are, it's an insurance-based.
We had to make this decision very early on, and it's pretty common in women's health, right? So there's at least a 70% diagnostic gap for this condition.
Yeah.
And that's, it varies, but pretty much everywhere around the world, people aren't getting diagnosed, partly because of that standard of care and it gets in the way of diagnosis, partly because of the nuance around symptoms and the dynamic, right, that exists where, you get an 8-minute appointment and you're told to talk about one symptom. Well, if your
Yeah,
symptom
that's not
is
going to work, is it?
bleeding or abdominal pain, well, guess what? There's 1,000 things that could be.
Yeah.
So, we made the decision early on that for this condition, we had to make our solution something which didn't have a prescription wall. And so, we're aiming to find the regulatory path that will allow us to do that, so that it'll be something you could buy at the pharmacy, right, without having to go through your doctor. Now, we obviously want clinician referral, clinician support, clinician advice. It's very hard to find, right, for this space. There are very few experts in PCOS, same as endometriosis, same as other things like this. They're very busy. And even when a lot of experts in PCOS will be still focused on the fertility challenges, which is a significant part of it, but it's not all of it.
Not all of it, yeah.
So we have to kind of, be the water through the boulder, not, we can't necessarily, the current system doesn't support like that mainstream medtech kind of.
I mean, the thing that was going through my mind as you were speaking is that you're going to have plenty to keep you busy for the next few years. Let me ask you about the flip side to all those things. I mean, whenever we've spoken, you come across as being really kind of passionate about this area. What is it you enjoy the most about doing what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a personal perspective, and definitely like, in my mid-career, right, which, I'm probably at the tail of my mid-career now, I felt very boxed in kind of corporate kind of life. So, I think kind of our, the hierarchy, the structures of work, organizational charts, like it's very much like industrial revolution design. It's like treats us like we're machines where we sit in a box and we do that as well as we possibly can. But that's what we can do until we get promoted into another role where we learn to, be the machine that does that. It felt, and I was someone who was always just like not, I'm not a political person. So, I was always like, well, I'm just going to do as good a job as possible. And if there's something I can help with that's a challenge for the company or the organization, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to try and help. That's not what's rewarded in kind of our.
Which is absurd, really, when you think about it. It's absurd that that's the case.
Like, I mean, I think we can all relate to those circumstances.
Yeah.
And so kind of stepping into entrepreneurship, it's like, there's lots of situations which are under-resourced, right? But you're creating, right? We're in a vacuum. So you're creating something that didn't exist before. You're your own boss, right? I think in a startup, even if you're an analyst in a startup, you're still kind of your own boss, right? Because it doesn't have the same management kind of layer, right, around it. And so, it's the opportunity to like flourish, right? To not sit in a box and feel constrained by that. And I think for me, I learn something new every day, right? I have to overcome my own, myself, my own mindsets on an ongoing basis. Like I have to get over myself, right? When I started out, like it's probably like just kind of, you can check out YouTube. Like if you see me pitching 3 years ago, it's like, right? Like, because like all these things you have to build in your toolkit to be an entrepreneur. Like there's no choice, right?
You get to learn a lot, don't you?
You have to get on with it and you have to figure it out. So I'm somebody who loves that,
Yeah.
right? I don't, you know, I, I'm not somebody who's like, I'm just gonna like rest on my laurels and do the same thing
No, I
again.
mean, I get that, but I can't see you resting on your laurels at all. That doesn't, that's not you at all, I don't think. Um, what would, if you were to go back to square one, knowing what you know now, is there anything you'd do differently?
With the company or like square one,
Well,
square.
in terms, I mean, I was thinking about how you built the business, but I mean, more generally as well. I mean, is there anything, what would you do differently if you could do it all again? If you could start again?
I don't know. I think, I mean, I came to entrepreneurship late in life. So I think probably, I would have done that younger. Not
Yeah.
that I would change a thing right now, but I think kind of it's definitely, there is lots of learning curves, right? And so I could have learned on other people's, like with the risk sitting more on other people than myself, right? If I'd have come to this younger. And potentially, one of my good friends from business school wrote the 10% entrepreneur. So I'll give a shout out to Patrick. Like I think a lot of people, that's a very effective way to like have a job and kind of take on limited risk by having your side gig kind of on top of
Yeah.
work. So I could have done that. I think in terms of the business, um, I uh, off like there's a lot of stuff I just can get on and do myself, right? And that's a real asset
Mm.
when you're like in this early stage startup. I think probably I would have accumulated over my career more of those skills, right? To be able to just do things yourself.
Mm.
Um, I can hack away at things, but some stuff you kind of need people who've had 5-10 years experience doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, specific things, um, I don't know, right? Like we're at a really, it's taken a lot, but we're in a really good spot right now. So, we pivoted 3 years ago, and we haven't taken in a lot of capital over that time, but we've been very focused on getting our pilot clinical study up and running, and that's kind of now kicked off.
Mhm.
Um, and then, I think without the kind of hard graft around digging in, the solution, right, in terms of, thinking about things like UX UI, but also thinking about like the real heart of that digital solution, we would have attacked that in a very different way if we hadn't have had the time and the
Yeah.
in-depth work. So sometimes things just take time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And is,
That's okay.
if you were to offer a piece of advice to somebody embarking on a sort of journey like yours, I mean, what would that one piece of crucial advice be to a rookie CEO, for example?
Well, I mean, I think kind of you have to realize that for a reasonable length of time, you as the CEO will be the limiting factor.
Mm.
And so it's your, like, you can talk about, your job is to bring in the money and the people and set the vision, right? Like functionally, but, unless you kind of have that weird thing where you're like, part of my job is to prove I was wrong yesterday, right? Right, is to constantly get better, right? And uncover your blind spots, right? Unless you have that weird gene where you're
Mm.
okay to embrace that journey, it's going to be, you're going to hit a wall, right?
And
Like,
what would you say, what would you suggest people do about that? I mean, you're absolutely right. But the question is, what would you say? But what would you suggest somebody does about that?
um I think, as in a lot of things in life, you kind of have to like try little experiments,
Mm.
right? And see, like, it's like making mistakes, right? Like the first mistake you make is like the sky is falling, right? You have to kind of acclimatize yourself
Mm.
somewhat to being in that it's the growth zone, basically, right? You have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so like that expands, right? It gets bigger and bigger, you know.
It's interesting you describe it that way. I mean, one of the things I like working with entrepreneurs is that they're much more open about what they've done wrong, because if you don't fix it, you end up with an even bigger problem. So the entrepreneurs are pretty good about that, I think, and that's one of the things that they do really, really well on the whole. I mean, not all of them, but some of it. But whereas, if you deal with government, for example, or sometimes the third sector, they never admit they've ever done anything wrong, and that always worries me because
Yeah.
you can't learn if you don't recognise that something's not right. So it's an interesting thing you just described. Let me just ask you one question before we wind up, because, like I said earlier on, I know you've got quite big ambitions. What is it that excites you about the next bit of the journey? Because you've got some quite exciting stuff on the horizon, haven't you? I mean, what is it about that? What is it that excites you the most?
Yeah, I mean, the I do want to accelerate things, right? I do want to get this product out. I do want to get it cleared through the regulatory agencies. I want to get the app into a mobile version, right? And realize the vision I have, right, into something that
Yep.
works and looks good. I think the thing that we do need capital, right, to accelerate things. We can keep this pace, right, in terms of making small bits of progress, but we do need capital. And so, we'll hopefully be raising money later this year. And so, investors told us, so I was like, what do you need to see? And they're like, we need to see more clinical data. So hopefully that comes through, and then we can kind of shift gears, because, I think in the kind of women's health investment domain, we had like that, many billions actually have gone into reproductive health, making babies. Everybody likes making babies. I think the world kind of woke up to menopause and the fact that,
Yeah.
51% of us are going to go through it for sure. So it's probably worth paying attention to. And I feel like it feels like now is the time for these chronic conditions like PCOS, endometriosis, fibroids, autoimmune conditions, things that differently or disproportionately affect women, to really come into play. That's what it feels like. So I'm optimistic about that. And then, I think kind of, I just really want to get this in the hands of the people who need it, who are crying out for something new.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Claire, I mean, what a great thing to be working on. And thank you for making a bit of time to talk us through that and to tell the story, if you like. Absolutely fascinating. And like you said, I mean, really powerful stuff. I mean, once it's starting to have an impact, it'll have a big impact. And what's not to love about that? That seems to be a pretty good thing to me. So good luck going forwards, and thanks for making a bit of time to come and talk to us about what you're doing.
Absolute pleasure. It flew by, Paul.
All right. See you soon, Claire.
That's it for hours. All right.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.